This is 20 Minutes of Impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast, sponsored by Americans for a Clean Energy Grid. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast, my guest is Kris Zadlo, President and Chief Technical Officer of independent transmission developer Grid United. Kris is going to describe how expanding U.S. interregional transmission is urgently needed to integrate the segmented regions of the electric network and make electricity delivery more reliable and affordable. Kris started his 35-year career with the Midwestern electric utility Commonwealth Edison, and then held executive positions in transmission with energy sector powerhouses Calpine and Invenergy before becoming head of Grid United in June 2021. So, Kris, here's the core question of the day. At a high level, and we're going to get to details about finance and that sort of thing in a minute, how would more interregional transmission be different than today's network? And what needs would interregional transmission meet that are not being met today?
Yeah. Well, good afternoon, Herman, and thank you for inviting me to the podcast. Great questions, and most Americans do not appreciate that in the United States, our grid is extremely fragmented. In fact, most people don't even realize we have three separate electrical grids. And it's very difficult for power to move between regions. But we know that different regions experience different load demands and have different generation mixes. And it would be very advantageous for us to be able to connect all of our regions together and move power back and forth. And there's countless studies, national studies, academic studies that show that if we were to connect these grids together, there would be attributable savings to consumers.
Yeah, exactly. And without connecting these segments, there's opportunities to move things from one place to another that just don't can't be met, right?
Absolutely. So we know the United States is a very big place, right? And we have different weathers in different parts of the country, and we have different demand and uh, different seasons. And it would be very advantageous to move power from one part of the country to the next. And unfortunately, that does not happen today. But if it could happen, we could more effectively and efficiently manage the grid and
Right.
lower the cost to consumers.
Yeah, that's the next question that I want to ask you is about the costs and the benefits. But before I get to that, one quick question. How does interest in interregional transmission relate to what some people are calling the macro grid initiative? It's being sponsored by American Council on Renewable Energy and the Americans for Clean Energy Grid. They're talking about an initiative called the macro grid initiative. Is that sort of the same thing as your interest in interregional transmission connections?
It's similar, but not quite the same. I think the macro grid is more about building massive lines across the United States, and we're more focused on tying specific regions in the US.
Interesting. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the bottom line, the costs and benefits. What can you tell us about the potential cost? Because it seems like it's going to be a lot of money to build big transmission. And what do we get? What are the benefits we're going to get for that investment?
So, Herman, absolutely correct. It would be extremely expensive. These interregional lines are very costly. We're talking on the orders of several billions, billion here, billion there. So these interregional lines are not inexpensive. However, when you quantify the benefits, this kind of underscores how beneficial they are to the consumer. The benefits go 2x, 3x, even 5x. So
Wow.
if you're spending $2 billion dollars on a project, the consumers are receiving $10 billion dollars in benefits. So clearly they're positive on it.
Interesting. I mean, and that just shows what the opportunities are out there. you can bring in consumers, as I understand it, consumers get the benefit of, let's say, lower cost electricity, right?
Correct. So what happens is the systems, the specific utilities are able to optimize their generation dispatch, their profiles, their economics to essentially lower the overall cost to the consumer.
Right. So somebody a few states over might have solar energy available, and where you are, maybe that's not available. Maybe a more expensive form of electricity could be generated, but it would cost you a few cents more per kilowatt hour. But when you talk about 10 million people or 50 million people, or in a big city, even more, who are getting a discount in price for that electricity, that's a lot of savings, right?
Yeah, that's a lot of savings, and those savings are driven primarily by two factors. You hit on one, and that's the diversity of load, right? When you think about a transmission line that might be 400 or 500 miles long, you could think about, well, the sun sets at a different time at one end of the line versus the other, right? That's a
Right,
very simplistic example, right? But
right,
then you have the load, right? That the load profile in that region might be drastically different in another region. Uh, so that's another reason. And the last reason is generation differences, right?
mm,
So a great example is if you were to interconnect the plain states with the desert Southwest. The plain states extremely rich in wind. Wind tends to be a nocturnal resource. The desert Southwest extremely rich in photovoltaic production. If you all of a sudden connected those two regions, right, you've got a
right.
phenomenal resource that both regions can take advantage of.
The area that doesn't have sun during the day gets it from the southwest. The area that doesn't have wind in the evening gets it from the north, right?
Right, right. So that's a very simplistic way of how interregional lines can provide value to consumers on a day-to-day basis. But there's other value streams that go unquantified and that we know from our experience in Europe, and that is the intraday benefits and the
Mm,
extreme weather events.
right,
So let's first talk about intraday. Uh, what the Europeans have found was they started building these, what they call interconnectors between countries, and they found that the intraday savings, that the powers moving back and forth are very large. In fact, these interconnecting lines that they expected would pay off over 20 years ended up paying off in 2 to 5 years because they didn't appreciate and the studies didn't show kind of the intraday volatility that it helped to mitigate. So that was one. And the other thing is extreme weather events. We talk about Storm Uri. That's a great example. You get massive transmission interconnections that in time of distress, the grid can get help from another region. And in that situation, the line pays off for itself in literally a couple of weeks.
right. Winter Storm Uri, people died because Texas wasn't getting electricity that was available in neighboring regions, right? I mean, you can't put a price on the benefit of those people not dying.
Yep, that's correct.
Okay, let me move on. I want to set aside the big issue of siting and permitting for a minute. I want to talk about barriers, other kinds of barriers besides the siting and permitting barriers. What kinds of things like economic self-interest I've heard is a big obstruction to interregional transmission development. Um, and what other barriers are on your mind, Kris? And more importantly, how important is it right now with all this growing demand on the US power system? How important is it to get past those barriers?
Yeah, Both great questions. And so let's talk about the barriers. Uh, what we're the construct in the United States is that we have very good rules dictating how transmission expansion needs to happen in a particular state, particular region, or a particular ISO. Those rules are very established and known. What's missing is rules about transmission lines interconnecting to your neighbor. Okay, 30 or 40 years ago, if a utility wanted to build to its neighbor, it built to its neighbor built to the border, and they connected the line, right? Now, those rules essentially don't exist, right? That sort of approach doesn't exist. And people get caught up about, okay, well, if we build this line and you get 60% of the value and I only get 40, the, then we should split 60-40 and the other side may not agree it. And that's kind of where it all falls apart, right? So that kind of
70-30. It's not 60-40, it's 70-30, and I want you to pay 70%.
right, right. And it's pretty ironic because at a high level, people can agree there's a lot of benefit, but there's almost like a false precision here that people think that they can dial in the exact value of the line and the whole process kind of falls apart, right? So that's one barrier. What was the second question? I apologize, Herman. You
Why
you
is it, you
asked.
know, no, I often throw out a lot of questions to see what lands. The question is, right now we're facing huge new demands on the power system. Don't you think it's more important now to get past those barriers? That's the
Yes.
question.
Yeah. So here's the really nifty thing about interregional lines. In a market where we have scarce capacity, right? And people are building new generation. And by the way, we're a transmission agnostic company. Uh, we believe in all forms of generation. Um, in a country that requires capacity in order to grow, an interregional line can actually provide that capacity. And what am I talking about? Well, going back to the example, right, where you're connecting two regions that are peaking at different times, that have different meteorological weather events, that have different generation resources, right? Those two regions can share their installed capacity with one another. And we know from performing loss of load expectancy studies that the transmission line can have an accredited capacity to it. So what we found is, and this is pretty amazing, that if you build a gigawatt transmission line, 50% of that capacity can be accredited to either side.
Mm.
Right? And when you think about the cost of generation these days, of how expensive it is in a lot of ways, building transmission is the least cost capacity solution for consumers today.
So one region might be having an emergency and need generation. The other region may not be having that emergency, and the transmission is the way to get that 50% that belongs to both sides to the one that needs it, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
If you want to hear the big last exchange of this terrific conversation, support the podcast by subscribing at just $2.99 per month to the Power Sector Podcasts Power More. With your subscription, you'll get both parts of the content delivered directly to you the second they drop.